Luzon, Philippines, January 29, 1945, 05:30 hours. Colonel Takeshi Matsumura stands in the reinforced command bunker overlooking the Damortis defense line. Watching his artillery crews complete their final preparations, confident that the elaborate network of tunnels, pre-sighted firing positions, and interlocking fields of fire will bleed the Americans white when they attempt to push inland from Lingayen Gulf. His 23rd Artillery Regiment has transformed this coastal plain into a fortress, with every road junction registered, every approach covered by at least 3 gun positions, and enough ammunition stockpiled to sustain weeks of defensive fire. What Colonel Matsumura cannot possibly know, what no Japanese artillery officer in the Philippines could imagine in their most pessimistic assessments, is that American M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers are already moving into position less than 8 kilometers away, and within hours, these mobile gun platforms will revolutionize artillery warfare in the Pacific, turning his meticulously prepared static defenses into death traps, and demonstrating that the age of horse-drawn and fixed artillery has ended forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Japanese Army's confidence in conventional artillery doctrine comes from decades of successful employment, from victories in Manchuria and China, where carefully positioned guns supporting infantry attacks proved devastatingly effective, from the belief that artillery warfare remains fundamentally unchanged since the Great War, a matter of survey, calculation, preparation, and volume of fire from positions chosen for their defensive strength. Major Kenji Watanabe, commanding the 3rd Battery, positioned 3 kilometers east of Damortis, has supervised the construction of elaborate revetments for his Type 91 105mm howitzers, each gun emplaced in a carefully designed pit that provides protection from counter-battery fire while allowing a wide field of fire across the approaching routes the Americans must use. His crews have spent 2 weeks preparing alternate positions, stockpiling ammunition in hardened bunkers, and rehearsing the rapid displacement drills that Japanese doctrine emphasizes for survivability against enemy artillery. The Type 91 howitzer itself represents the pinnacle of Japanese artillery design in the 1930s, a licensed copy of the French Schneider design modified for regiments, capable of firing a 15.7 kilogram shell to a maximum range of 10,800 meters with reasonable accuracy when properly laid. The gun weighs 2,840 kilograms in firing position, requiring a team of horses or a tracked artillery tractor to move it between positions, a process that takes skilled crews approximately 40 minutes from the order to displace until the gun is ready to fire from its new location. Japanese artillery officers consider this mobility adequate because their doctrine assumes artillery will occupy positions for days or weeks, engaging in deliberate fire missions planned hours in advance, not the rapid displacement and immediate fire missions that characterize modern mobile warfare. Colonel Matsumura's defensive plan reflects orthodox Japanese artillery thinking, based on the principle of massed fires from concealed positions. His 18 105mm howitzers are distributed across 6 kilometers of front, each battery of 3 guns positioned to support the others, with extensive telephone lines connecting every position to the fire direction center buried deep in the command bunker. The communications network represents months of labor, with redundant lines buried at varying depths and alternate radio systems prepared in case the landlines are cut. Forward observers occupy positions that allow them to see every meter of ground the Americans must cross, their coordinates precisely plotted, their fields of observation overlapping to ensure no dead ground exists where enemy forces might advance undetected. The ammunition supply for Matsumura's regiment reflects the desperate state of Japanese logistics in early 1945, with shells carefully rationed and priorities established for different types of targets. High explosive rounds are reserved for attacking infantry concentrations and vehicles, while the limited supply of armor-piercing shells must be husbanded for the American tanks that intelligence reports indicate are operating with the infantry. Each gun position maintains 200 rounds in immediate storage, with additional ammunition cached in dispersed locations to prevent a single lucky strike from destroying the entire battery's combat power. The crews have been ordered to make every shot count, understanding that resupply is unlikely and that they must hold these positions regardless of losses. The Japanese artillerymen manning these positions are not the elite troops who conquered Singapore and Burma in 1942, but a mixture of veterans withdrawn from shattered divisions in New Guinea and raw conscripts who received abbreviated training before being rushed to the Philippines. Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura, a gun commander in Major Watanabe's battery, survived the hell of Biak Island, where American firepower systematically destroyed his previous unit, and he teaches his young gunners the harsh lessons learned there. Dig deeper than regulation requires, never expose yourself unnecessarily, and understand that American artillery will always outnumber and outgun Japanese forces. But Nakamura and his fellow NCOs still believe that skillfully employed artillery from prepared positions can exact a terrible price from attacking Americans, that discipline and determination can compensate for material deficiencies. What makes January 29, 1945, fundamentally different from every previous Japanese defensive battle is not immediately apparent to the forward observers who report American activity at first light. Lieutenant Yoshito Tanaka, positioned in a camouflaged observation post overlooking the coastal highway, sees what appears to be a standard American advance. Infantry moving cautiously forward in squad columns, supported by tanks that halt frequently while scouts check for mines and obstacles. The scene fits Japanese expectations of methodical American tactics that rely on overwhelming firepower and careful preparation rather than speed or surprise. Tanaka reports the American positions to the Fire Direction Center, requesting permission to call fire missions, confident that his battery's guns will punish any attempt to advance across the open ground.
But Tanaka and his fellow observers have not yet seen the M7 priests, have not witnessed the revolution in mobile artillery that is about to render Japanese defensive doctrine obsolete. The development of self-propelled artillery represents American industrial and tactical thinking at its most innovative, born from the recognition that towed artillery, no matter how well designed, suffers from fundamental limitations in mobility and reaction time that make it vulnerable in fluid warfare. The M7 Priest, officially designated 105mm howitzer motor carriage M7, mounts the standard M2A1 105mm howitzer on a modified M3 Lee tank chassis, creating a mobile fire platform that can keep pace with armored advances, displace rapidly under fire, and provide immediate supporting fire without the lengthy setup procedures required by towed guns. The Priest's design reflects practical lessons learned from observing German combined arms operations in Europe and from American experiences in North Africa, where towed artillery frequently found itself unable to support rapidly moving tank formations. The M3 chassis provides the automotive reliability American industry excels at producing, with a Continental R975 radial engine delivering 340 horsepower that propels the 22.5-ton vehicle at speeds up to 26 miles per hour on roads and 15 miles per hour cross-country. The armor protection, while modest by tank standards, frontal armor ranges from 12mm to 108mm, provides adequate protection against small arms fire and shell fragments that would devastate the crews of towed guns. Most crucially, the M7 can displace from firing position to road march in less than 2 minutes, move several kilometers, and return to action in another 2 minutes, a cycle that requires 40 minutes or more for towed artillery. The tactical employment of M7 priests in the Philippines represents the culmination of doctrine development that began in North Africa and was refined through the Italian and French campaigns. By January 1945, American artillery officers understand that self-propelled guns must be employed differently from towed artillery, used aggressively to provide immediate fire support for advancing infantry, positioned well forward where they can engage targets of opportunity, and displaced frequently to prevent effective counter-battery fire. The 63rd Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 18 M7 priests, organized into 3 6-gun batteries, has trained extensively for operations in close terrain where their mobility and armor protection provide maximum advantage over conventional artillery. Major Robert Henderson, commanding the 63rd Field Artillery Battalion, received his orders at 04:45 hours. Support the advance of the 129th Infantry Regiment by providing immediate suppressive fire against Japanese positions, with specific emphasis on neutralizing enemy artillery that intelligence indicates is well prepared along the axis of advance. Henderson's operations officer, Captain James Milliken, has plotted known Japanese gun positions based on prisoner interrogation and photo reconnaissance, but both officers understand that the real targets will be identified by forward observers moving with the infantry, requiring the priests to respond within minutes to fire missions against targets the Japanese believe are safely out of range of immediate counterfire. The Japanese first become aware that something unprecedented is happening when American infantry, instead of halting at the expected range where Japanese artillery can engage them from prepared positions, continue advancing with apparent disregard for the consequences. Lieutenant Tanaka, watching from his observation post, assumes the Americans have made a tactical error, exposing themselves prematurely to Japanese fires. He calls for a fire mission against the advancing infantry, providing coordinates and requesting immediate response. The Fire Direction Center acknowledges and begins calculating firing data, the process that normally takes 3 to 5 minutes while survey teams confirm coordinates, calculate propellant charges, and relay firing commands. But before Major Watanabe's guns can complete their fire mission, before the first Japanese shells leave their tubes, 6 M7 priests of Battery A, 63rd Field Artillery Battalion, come roaring forward from positions 2 kilometers behind the advancing infantry, their tracks churning the soft Philippine soil as they accelerate to maximum speed. Staff Sergeant William Morrison, commanding the lead priest nicknamed Absolution, brings his vehicle to a halt on a slight rise that provides clear observation toward the Japanese positions, and within 90 seconds of stopping, before the Japanese Fire Direction Center has even transmitted final firing commands to its batteries, Morrison's gunner, Corporal Thomas Reeves, sends the first 105mm high-explosive round screaming toward the coordinates provided by the battalion forward observer. The effect on the Japanese battery is immediate and catastrophic. The American shell, arriving without warning from a direction the Japanese had not registered as containing artillery positions, detonates 30 meters from Major Watanabe's command post, showering the area with fragments and announcing that the Americans have artillery, forward, impossibly forward by Japanese understanding of artillery employment. Before Watanabe can react, before his crews can attempt the displacement drills they've rehearsed, 5 more priests open fire, their rounds impacting across the battery position at 15-second intervals, a rate of fire impossible for towed guns that must be relayed after each shot.
Sergeant Nakamura, crouching beside his Type 91 howitzer, watches in horror as American shells systematically demolish the carefully prepared position his crew has occupied for 2 weeks. The first round destroys the ammunition bunker, detonating storage shells in a massive explosion that kills 4 gunners instantly and wounds 3 more with flying metal. The second shell lands directly in the gun pit of the adjacent howitzer, flipping the 2,840-kilogram gun onto its side and crushing the gunner beneath the barrel. Nakamura screams orders to displace, knowing that doctrine requires moving the guns before the American artillery can accurately range the position, but the process of limbering the heavy howitzer to its tractor takes precious minutes that his battery no longer has. What Nakamura and his fellow Japanese gunners cannot comprehend is that the American artillery is not stationary, not anchored to positions that require elaborate preparation to abandon. Even as Battery A continues pounding Watanabe's position, Battery B displaces 2 kilometers north and begins engaging the Japanese batteries supporting that sector, while Battery C moves into position to cover both friendly batteries should Japanese artillery attempt counter-battery fire. The priests operate like armored cavalry, constantly moving, presenting fleeting targets that Japanese forward observers struggle to track. Impossible to engage with the methodical fire missions Japanese doctrine requires. Colonel Matsumura, receiving panicked reports from multiple battery commanders simultaneously, cannot initially grasp what is happening to his carefully orchestrated defense. His training and experience provide no framework for understanding artillery that moves like tanks, that engages and displaces before counter-battery fire can be organized, that operates forward in the direct fire zone where conventional artillery would be suicidally exposed. He orders his remaining batteries to execute pre-planned fires against the American infantry positions, attempting to salvage his defensive fire plan, but discovers that his batteries are being systematically outshouted, a Japanese strongpoint built around a concrete pillbox at grid reference 547389. The fire mission goes from observer request to shells impacting in less than 4 minutes. 2 M7 priests operating in direct fire mode at a range of 800 meters placed 20 rounds of high explosive through and around the pillbox entrance in less than 3 minutes. The sustained fire rate possible only because the crews don't need to manhandle ammunition from separated storage to the guns. They simply reach for the next round in the armored fighting compartment's racks. By 0800 hours, Colonel Matsumura's artillery regiment has effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Of his 18 105mm howitzers, 11 have been destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair, 4 have been abandoned by crews who fled under the relentless American fire, and only 3 remain in action, displaced to hasty positions from which they fire opportunistic missions before moving again to avoid the American counter-battery fire that arrives with terrifying speed. The elaborate telephone network lies cut by shell fire in dozens of places, forcing reliance on radio communications that American signals intelligence intercepts and uses to locate the remaining Japanese guns. The psychological impact on Japanese artillery crews proves even more devastating than the physical destruction. Sergeant Nakamura, one of approximately 40 survivors from Major Watanabe's battery of 72 men, describes the experience in his journal as fighting against demons in steel shells who could not be killed or driven away, who destroyed everything we had built with what seemed like casual ease. The fundamental assumption of Japanese artillery doctrine that guns positioned in prepared defenses with adequate ammunition can hold against numerically superior attackers shatters completely when the enemy's artillery refuses to remain stationary, when fire missions arrive faster than Japanese crews can respond, when displacement and survival become impossible because the American guns follow their targets. The infantry accompanying the M7 priests witnesses the transformation of mobile artillery from concept to devastating reality. Private First Class Anthony Russo, an ammunition carrier with Company G, describes watching the priests just pull up like they owned the place, start blasting away, then take off before the Japs could figure out where the hell they were. It was like having tanks that shot artillery shells, and the Japs just couldn't handle it. Their guns would fire from some position, and before they could celebrate hitting anything, our priests would be pounding that position into gravel. The Japanese attempts to counter the priests prove tragically inadequate, based as they are on doctrine developed for fighting conventional towed artillery. Several Japanese artillery observers call for fire missions against spotted M7 positions, only to have their carefully calculated coordinates become irrelevant when the priests displace 2 or 3 kilometers before the counter-battery shells arrive.
One Japanese artillery commander, Captain Ichiro Yamada, attempts a more aggressive response, ordering his guns to move forward into direct fire positions where they might engage the American self-propelled guns. But the Type 91 howitzers, each requiring a team of horses and 40 minutes to displace and emplace, become perfect targets for American fighter bombers who are called in by forward observers specifically to destroy artillery caught in movement.
By midday, the American infantry advance that Japanese planners estimated would require 3 to 4 days of heavy fighting to penetrate the Damortis defense line has punched through 6 kilometers of prepared positions in less than 7 hours. The M7 priests, having fired more than 1,400 rounds in support of the advance, have achieved a breakthrough at a cost of 0 vehicles destroyed and only 2 crewmen wounded when shell fragments found the open fighting compartment of one priest that was engaging at particularly close range. This exchange ratio, 18 Japanese guns destroyed or captured for 0 American self-propelled guns lost, represents a revolution in the mathematics of warfare that Japanese commanders struggle to comprehend. The human cost becomes apparent as American forces secure the former Japanese artillery positions. The gun pits and bunkers that Sergeant Nakamura's crew spent weeks constructing have become graveyards, littered with the bodies of men who died manning or attempting to save their guns. Medical personnel treating Japanese wounded discover soldiers suffering from psychological trauma that goes beyond the normal shock of combat. Men who babble incoherently about American artillery that moved faster than tanks, who refuse to believe they fought against howitzers rather than direct-fire assault guns, who insist that some new American wonder weapon has made conventional artillery obsolete. Colonel Matsumura, evacuating his shattered command with the approximately 200 survivors of his 800-man regiment, drafts a preliminary report to General Yamashita's headquarters describing the American employment of self-propelled artillery. His assessment proves remarkably accurate despite the chaos and brevity of the engagement. The enemy has developed mobile artillery that combines the firepower of conventional howitzers with the mobility and protection of armored vehicles. This weapon system renders traditional artillery defensive positions untenable, as it can deliver accurate fire faster than our guns can respond and can displace before effective counter-battery fire is possible. Recommend immediate tactical adaptations and urgent development of similar capabilities. But by the time Matsumura's report reaches higher headquarters and is analyzed, the M7 priests have already moved on to their next engagement, supporting the American drive toward Manila with the same devastating effectiveness they demonstrated at Damortis. The Steel Priests, as Japanese soldiers begin calling them in whispered conversations, have announced the end of an era in military technology and tactics, proving that the side which adapts fastest to technological change gains advantages that transcend mere numbers or courage. The human cost becomes apparent as American forces secure the former Japanese artillery positions. The gun pits and bunkers that Sergeant Nakamura's crew spent weeks constructing have become graveyards, littered with the bodies of men who died manning or attempting to save their guns. Medical personnel treating Japanese wounded discover soldiers suffering from psychological trauma that goes beyond the normal shock of combat. Men who babble incoherently about American artillery that moved faster than tanks, who refuse to believe they fought against howitzers rather than direct-fire assault guns, who insist that some new American wonder weapon has made conventional artillery obsolete. Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, commanding the Shimbu Group defending the approaches to Manila, reads Matsumura's detailed after-action report with growing alarm. Yokoyama is a career artillery officer who rose through the ranks based on his mastery of conventional fire support doctrine, and he immediately grasps the implications of what Matsumura describes. The American self-propelled guns represent not merely an incremental improvement, but a qualitative leap that renders obsolete the carefully developed Japanese artillery tactics that served effectively throughout the China campaigns. Yokoyama convenes an emergency conference of his artillery commanders on February 2, 1945, at his headquarters in the Marikina Valley, where he presents Matsumura's findings and demands recommendations for countering this new threat. The discussion that follows reveals the depth of Japanese understanding of their predicament and the poverty of solutions available with existing equipment and doctrine. Colonel Saburo Ishii, commanding the 8th Artillery Regiment, proposes aggressive counter-battery fire using massed guns to saturate areas where American self-propelled artillery operates, but this suggestion founders on the reality that Japanese ammunition supplies are strictly rationed, and that concentrating guns for massed fires creates lucrative targets for American air power. Major Tatsuo Kikuchi suggests positioning anti-tank guns forward to engage the M7 priests in direct fire, treating them as armored vehicles rather than artillery, but this tactic requires exposing the anti-tank guns to the very problem they're meant to solve: superior American mobility and firepower.
What emerges from Yokoyama's conference is not a solution, but an acknowledgement of the problem's severity. Japanese artillery in the Philippines must accept that they cannot win artillery duels with M7 priests using conventional tactics, that survival rather than sustained fire support must become the primary objective, and that the infantry will need to fight increasingly without the artillery support that doctrine considers essential for successful defensive operations. These conclusions, transmitted to subordinate units in carefully worded directives that attempt to maintain morale while communicating harsh realities, mark a turning point in Japanese artillery employment. The transition from offensive fire support to preservation of assets that might be useful in delaying actions. The spread of M7 priests across American units in the Philippines accelerates following the Damortis success. By mid-February 1945, the 6th Army operates 5 field artillery battalions equipped with M7s, the 63rd, 82nd, 204th, 226th, and 979th Field Artillery Battalions, totaling 90 self-propelled howitzers that provide mobile fire support for infantry divisions pushing toward Manila and into the mountainous terrain of northern Luzon. Each battalion develops its own tactical innovations based on the terrain and opposition it encounters, creating a rich exchange of lessons learned that flows through artillery channels and continuously improves M7 employment doctrine.
The 82nd Field Artillery Battalion, supporting operations in the urban environment of Manila, discovers that M7 priests excel at direct fire against fortified buildings, using their armor protection to approach within 300 meters of Japanese strongpoints before systematically demolishing them with high-explosive shells. Captain Richard Browning, commanding Battery B of the 82nd, develops a technique he calls thunder runs, rapid dashes by individual priests through contested streets to firing positions that provide enfilade fire against Japanese positions, followed by immediate withdrawal before enemy forces can concentrate anti-tank weapons. These aggressive tactics prove devastatingly effective in the street fighting, with single priests destroying entire Japanese company positions that might have required days of infantry combat to reduce. Japanese defenders in Manila, already struggling against overwhelming American firepower, find the M7 priests particularly demoralizing because they represent artillery that behaves like tanks, appearing suddenly at close range to deliver crushing fire before disappearing. Private First Class Kenji Sato, captured after the fall of Intramurals on February 23, tells his interrogators that the steel priests made us feel completely helpless. We could prepare for tanks with anti-tank mines and suicide squads. We could shelter from conventional artillery in our fortifications, but these machines combine the worst of both, and we had no effective defense. This sense of helplessness against a weapon system that negates traditional defensive measures spreads through Japanese units, contributing to the psychological erosion that accompanies the physical destruction of Japanese forces. The technical evolution of M7 employment continues throughout the Philippine campaign as crews and commanders discover capabilities and limitations through combat experience. The open-topped fighting compartment, initially considered a vulnerability, proves less problematic than expected, because the priests typically operate at ranges where small arms fire is ineffective, and the crews develop discipline about buttoning up when operating in close terrain where Japanese infiltrators might throw grenades into the fighting compartment. The ammunition capacity of 69 rounds, initially thought adequate for sustained operations, proves limiting during extended engagements, leading to the development of improved ammunition resupply procedures where half-tracks loaded with shells shadow the priests and transfer ammunition during brief operational pauses. The maintenance demands of M7 operations in tropical conditions challenge the supporting ordnance companies, but prove manageable due to the robust design of the M3 chassis and the Continental engine. Sergeant Maurice Thompson, a mechanic with the 63rd Field Artillery Battalion Service Battery, describes the M7 as surprisingly reliable considering what we put it through, driving through rice paddies, fording rivers, operating in 100-degree heat with high humidity. The engine overheats occasionally, and we have to replace tracks more frequently than expected, but compared to some of the specialized vehicles we've dealt with, the Priest is a workhorse that keeps running. This mechanical reliability proves crucial to the sustained operations that characterize the Philippine campaign, where artillery battalions sometimes operate for weeks with limited access to depot-level maintenance facilities. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo receives multiple reports about American self-propelled artillery from commands throughout the Pacific Theater, not only from the Philippines, but also from Iwo Jima, where Marine artillery battalions employ M7s in support of the invasion,
and from Okinawa, where preparations for the expected American assault include intelligence assessments of enemy capabilities. The cumulative weight of these reports forces Japanese military planners to confront an uncomfortable reality. Japan possesses no equivalent to the M7 Priest and lacks the industrial capacity to develop and produce one in meaningful numbers, even if design work began immediately. Colonel Takashiro Hattori, a senior staff officer at Imperial General Headquarters, prepares a classified assessment in March 1945 that circulates among the highest levels of Japanese military leadership. Hattori's analysis acknowledges that American self-propelled artillery represents a category of weapon where Japan cannot achieve parity with existing resources, that the mobility and protection advantages of the M7 fundamentally alter the mathematics of artillery warfare in ways that favor the side with superior industrial production, and that Japanese forces must develop tactics that accept artillery inferiority rather than attempting to match American capabilities. These conclusions, devastating for a military culture that prizes offensive spirit and technological prowess, contribute to the increasingly pessimistic assessments that characterize Japanese strategic planning in the war's final months. The broader impact of M7 Priests on the Philippine campaign manifests in ways beyond direct combat effectiveness, influencing American operational tempo and Japanese defensive planning. The 63rd Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 129th Infantry Regiment's advance from Lingayen Gulf to the Cagayan Valley, covers 280 kilometers in 45 days of continuous operations, providing immediate fire support for multiple engagements while maintaining the mobility to keep pace with infantry advances that would have outrun conventional towed artillery. This sustained mobility allows American commanders to maintain pressure on retreating Japanese forces, denying them the time to establish new defensive positions and forcing them into hasty deployments that favor American firepower advantages. Japanese commanders, aware that American artillery can appear anywhere with minimal warning, cannot adopt the defense-in-depth tactics that might maximize their inferior numbers and firepower. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, recognizes that his artillery cannot provide the sustained fire support that would allow infantry to hold against American attacks, that his units must increasingly rely on small-unit infantry tactics and prepared defenses rather than coordinated combined arms operations. This recognition leads to the withdrawal of Japanese forces into mountainous terrain where American mobility advantages are minimized, a strategic retreat that concedes the economically vital lowlands and demonstrates how a single weapon system can influence campaign-level decisions.
The crew experiences aboard M7 Priests reveal the human dimension of this technological revolution. Staff Sergeant William Morrison, commanding Absolution through 3 months of continuous operations, describes the peculiar intimacy of self-propelled artillery combat. In a towed gun position, you're separated from the enemy by distance and the abstraction of coordinates on a map. In the Priest, you're close enough to see the targets you're engaging, close enough sometimes to see Japanese soldiers running from positions you're destroying. It makes it very real, very immediate. Some guys couldn't handle that psychological intensity, knowing that every round you fire is tearing apart human beings you can actually see. The physical demands of operating M7s in tropical combat conditions test crew endurance in ways that differ from conventional artillery. Corporal Thomas Reeves, gunner aboard Absolution, describes 12-hour days during heavy combat where the crew fires 150 to 200 rounds with temperatures inside the fighting compartment exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit from the combination of tropical heat and hot gun mechanisms. The noise level, from the engine, the gun firing, and the constant radio traffic, creates hearing damage that affects most crewmen despite issued hearing protection. The psychological stress of operating a vehicle that attracts concentrated enemy fire while remaining exposed in the open-topped fighting compartment creates a unique form of combat fatigue that battalion medical officers struggle to address with rest rotations and psychological support. Japanese attempts to develop countermeasures against M7 Priests become increasingly desperate as the Philippine campaign progresses. On March 15, 1945, a Japanese engineer unit near Baguio attempts to create a massive roadside mine using 500 pounds of explosives buried beneath the approach to a critical bridge, hoping to destroy an M7 Priest and block the route for following vehicles. The mine detonates successfully when a priest from the 226th Field Artillery Battalion crosses the trigger point, but the M3 chassis proves remarkably resilient. The explosion destroys the left track and damages the suspension, but the crew survives with minor injuries, and the vehicle is recovered and repaired within 72 hours. This incident demonstrates both Japanese ingenuity in attempting counters and the robust design of American equipment that survives attacks that would destroy lighter vehicles. The comparative analysis between M7 Priests and other artillery systems operating in the Pacific Theater provides context for understanding their revolutionary impact. The Marine Corps operates 75mm pack howitzers that can be disassembled and carried by mules in terrain inaccessible to vehicles, providing mobility of a different sort than the M7's automotive mobility. These pack howitzers prove invaluable in places like Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain, but they sacrifice range, shell weight, and rate of fire compared to 105mm weapons. The Army's towed 105mm M2A1 howitzers, when properly supported with trucks and prime movers, can deliver the same firepower as M7s at longer ranges because they're not constrained by the ammunition capacity of the self-propelled chassis, but they require significantly more time to displace and cannot operate in the direct fire zone where priests excel. The Japanese Type 1 self-propelled gun, mounting a 47mm anti-tank gun on a tracked chassis, represents Japan's attempt at mobile armored firepower, but the comparison with M7 Priests highlights the qualitative gap between Japanese and American armored vehicle production. The Type 1 carries a gun inadequate for artillery support missions, lacks the armor protection to operate in contested environments, and exists in numbers too small to influence campaigns. Fewer than 150 were produced during the entire war. This production comparison, 90 M7s in the Philippines alone versus 150 Japanese self-propelled guns of all types in the entire Pacific Theater, illustrates the industrial disparity that ultimately determines the war's outcome, regardless of tactical or operational skill. The influence of M7 Priest operations on post-war artillery doctrine proves profound and long-lasting. American artillery officers analyzing Philippine operations conclude that self-propelled guns should become the standard for field artillery and mobile warfare, that the combination of automotive mobility and armor protection justifies the compromises in ammunition capacity and firing range compared to towed systems. These conclusions lead directly to the development of the M37 and M52 self-propelled howitzers that equip American forces through the Korean War and into the Cold War era. The doctrinal emphasis on mobility, rapid displacement, and aggressive forward positioning that M7 crews pioneer in the Philippines becomes canonical in American artillery training and operations. Soviet military observers studying American operations in the Pacific through intelligence reports and captured documents draw their own conclusions about self-propelled artillery. The successful employment of M7 Priests influenced Soviet development of the Su-76 and later self-propelled guns that become standard equipment in Soviet mechanized forces. The doctrinal concept of artillery that can keep pace with tank advances, that can displace rapidly under fire, and that combines fire support with adequate protection, spreads beyond American forces to become a defining characteristic of Cold War combined arms doctrine across multiple nations. The stories of individual M7 crews become part of artillery culture, passed down through generations of gunners as examples of what the weapon system could accomplish. The action on April 3, 1945, when two priests from the 979th Field Artillery Battalion provided fire support for surrounded infantry companies near Bagong Sikat, firing 380 rounds in 4 hours while displacing 7 times to avoid Japanese counterfire, became a case study in mobile artillery employment taught at Fort Sill for decades.
The crews involved, men like Sergeant First Class Harold Patterson and his gunner, Corporal James Wu, received Silver Stars for their actions, but more importantly, their tactical decisions under extreme pressure established precedents that influenced how American artillery operated in subsequent conflicts. The final battles of the Philippine Campaign, in the Cagayan Valley and Sierra Madre Mountains during May and June 1945, demonstrate the full maturation of M7 employment doctrine. Artillery battalions operate with unprecedented autonomy, commanders empowered to position guns and select targets based on the tactical situation, rather than waiting for detailed fire missions from infantry commanders. This devolution of authority reflects recognition that self-propelled artillery possesses the mobility and situational awareness to act more like maneuver units than traditional artillery, that the speed of modern mobile warfare requires decentralized execution guided by commander's intent rather than centralized control.
Lieutenant General Yamashita, surrendering on September 2, 1945, in the mountains of northern Luzon, lists American artillery superiority among the primary factors that made Japanese defensive operations untenable. In post-war interrogations, he specifically mentions the M7 priests as representative of the technological and industrial gap that Japan could never bridge. Your self-propelled guns demonstrated that modern warfare requires not just brave soldiers, but industrial capacity to produce weapons in quantity and quality that we could not match. We could prepare for tanks, for airplanes, for conventional artillery, but when you combined these capabilities in new weapons, our tactical adaptations could not compensate for material inferiority. The human cost of the Philippine campaign, over 200,000 Japanese military deaths and approximately 14,000 American deaths, cannot be attributed to any single weapon system, but the M7 priests' contribution to American operational success appears clearly in the casualty exchange ratios for engagements where they provided fire support. Infantry units operating with immediate M7 support suffered 30 to 40% fewer casualties than comparable units dependent on towed artillery or without dedicated fire support, a statistically significant difference that reflects the priests' ability to suppress enemy positions rapidly and protect advancing infantry from the concentrated fires that caused most casualties in defensive warfare. The technical specifications of the M7 Priest, 22.5 tons combat weight, 340 horsepower engine, 26 miles per hour road speed, 12 to 108 mm armor protection, 105 mm M2A1 howitzer with 11,200 meter maximum range, 69 round ammunition capacity, 7-man crew, become benchmarks against which subsequent self-propelled artillery designs are measured. But the numbers alone cannot capture the weapon's impact on tactical and operational warfare. The M7 represented a fundamental reimagining of how artillery supports maneuver forces, a recognition that mobility and protection matter as much as firepower in modern combined arms operations, and that technological innovation can render obsolete doctrine and tactics that previously seemed immutable. The Japanese soldiers and officers who survived encounters with M7 priests carried memories that shaped their understanding of modern warfare long after hostilities ended. In the decades following the war, Japanese self-defense force artillery officers studying at American military schools encountered descendants of the M7, the M109 self-propelled howitzer and later systems, and recognized in these weapons the logical evolution of the capabilities that devastated Japanese forces in 1945. The institutional memory of facing self-propelled artillery without equivalent capabilities influenced Japanese defense procurement decisions, leading to the development of domestic self-propelled howitzer programs that reflected lessons learned at terrible cost during World War II.
The legacy of the M7 priest in the Philippines extends beyond military technology and doctrine to influence broader understanding of how innovation emerges during warfare. The priest was not a revolutionary new concept when it entered service. Self-propelled artillery existed before World War II, and the combination of guns and armored chassis was conceptually straightforward. What made the M7 revolutionary was the American ability to produce it in meaningful numbers, to develop effective employment doctrine through combat experience, and to integrate it into combined arms operations with an adaptability that Japanese forces could not match. This combination of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and institutional flexibility represents American advantages that transcended any single weapon system. The final assessment of M7 priest operations in the Philippine campaign, compiled by the U.S. Army's Artillery School at Fort Sill in late 1945, concludes that self-propelled artillery fundamentally changed the nature of fire support in mobile warfare, that the M7's success validated the concept of artillery as a maneuver arm rather than solely a support weapon, and that future conflicts would require even greater integration of mobility, firepower, and protection. These conclusions, drawn from the experiences of men like Staff Sergeant Morrison and his crew aboard Absolution, from the tactical innovations of officers like Captain Browning and Major Henderson, and from the hard-won lessons of continuous combat operations, established principles that continue to guide artillery development and employment into the 21st century. The steel priests that terrified Japanese soldiers in the Philippines were ultimately more than just machines. They were symbols of a changing form of warfare where industrial capacity, technological innovation, and tactical adaptation combined to create decisive advantages. The M7 priest's role in the Pacific War demonstrates that military success often depends less on traditional martial virtues than on the ability to produce, deploy, and effectively employ weapons that exploit enemy vulnerabilities while negating enemy strengths. For Japanese forces, trained and equipped for a different form of warfare, the encounter with M7 priests represented an object lesson in the dangers of technological and doctrinal stagnation, a lesson purchased with the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers who faced weapons against which their training and equipment provided no adequate defense.